Talking about the founding of Rhode Island. It's kind of an interesting story how Rhode Island was founded. In 1631, a deeply religious man by the name of Roger Williams arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Okay, in 1631, a deeply religious man by the name of Roger Williams arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he took up as a pastor of a church in Salem. He took up as a pastor of a church in Salem. So in 1631, a deeply religious man named Roger Williams arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he soon became a pastor in a church in Salem. Now the problem was, this young pastor's ideas saw opposition from the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And I'm going to give you three things that Williams believed in that the leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony did not. Okay? So this young pastor, Roger Williams, began to preach at a church in Salem, and soon leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony became concerned because his ideas drew some opposition to their philosophies. Here was the first thing Williams stated. He taught that the colonists had no right to the land unless they first bought it from the Indians. That's one thing that he emphasized among his congregation, is that the colonists had no right to the land unless they first bought it from the Indians. Boy, that'd be a novel thought, wouldn't it, when you think about, we're going to get into Native Americans in America and all that kind of business. It's going to be interesting to know that Roger Williams actually believed if you had any right to land that belonged to the Indians, you had to pay them for it. Man, oh man, that'd be a novel thought. He didn't figure that out for many, many years. Okay, so he taught that the colonists had no right to the land unless they bought it from the Indians. Number two, he also preached that political leaders within the Massachusetts Bay Colony should have no authority over religious matters. Should have no authority over religious matters. Now, how would that go over with those Puritan leaders? Not good, no. He preached that political leaders have no authority over religious matters. Now, the third one might have got him in the biggest trouble. He insisted that individuals had the right to worship God as their conscience directed them to do so, which meant they could go outside what? The Puritan beliefs, yeah. So these were three things that Williams emphasized to his congregation. One, that the colonists had no right to the land unless they first bought it from the Indians. Two, he preached that political leaders should have no authority over religious matters. And three, he insisted that individuals had the right to worship God as their conscience directed them to. Well, you can imagine that he met some opposition from Puritan leaders with that philosophy. Would you say not? These Puritan leaders actually saw Williams as his ideas as a threat to the colony. So what decision did they make?
Vanish.
And vanish him to where?
Wow.
No, that's a good guess.
That's wrong.
No, well, that's good. Where'd they banish him? Where are they going to send him back to? England. So that was good, Nick. That was close. So the Puritan leaders saw Williams and his ideas as a threat to the Massachusetts Bay Company, so they made the decision to send him back to England. We got to get this guy out of here. He's poisoning the thoughts of these people in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Well, banish him back to England. Well, he just got on the boat and said, well, sorry about that. You're right. I'm out of here. Right? No, what did he do? He fled. He fled through the wilderness and stayed with his friends that he had made, the Narragansett Indians. Okay? So, when he finds out they're going to ship him back to England, he flees or fled. He fled, and he took up with the Narragansett Indians, who he had befriended during his relationship in Salem. So when he hears they're going to banish him to England, he takes off and runs, basically fled through the wilderness, and takes up with the Narragansett Indians. Now, somebody, I think this might have been Nick that said this, I don't remember, So what he did is he lived with the Indians for several months, then he founded his own colony in the village of Providence in 1636. So after staying with the Indians until the coast was clear, so to speak, he then founded his own colony in the village of Providence. You've all heard of Providence, Rhode Island, I bet, haven't you?
Yeah.
In 1636, he founded the village of Providence. Well, to legally own it, what did he have to do? He had to get a charter, and he did that in 1644, and he called the colony Rhode Island. So he just settled a village early, or a city, so to speak, or a town, province. Then he got a charter in 1644, and he secured this larger amount of land, although it wasn't huge, but a larger amount of land known as Rhode Island. Now, once he secured that colony called Rhode Island, here's what they rested upon. What do I mean by that? You rested upon. What does that mean? This is what they rested upon. Yeah, they rested upon. This is what the rules were. This is what their philosophy was. Okay? So here's what they set up. First of all, they rested upon the consent of the governed. They rested upon the consent of the governed. What does that mean? What's another word for that? Consent of the governed. Okay? We're going to rest on the consent of the governed here. Who's the governed in here? You are. So we're going to rest on the consent of the governed. We're going to rest on the laws and rules that the governed make. Okay? Not somebody else, not a Puritan leader telling you what you have to do, but we're going to rest on the consent of the governed. It also rested upon this philosophy. Now this is kind of interesting, ladies. The right of all adult males to vote and have a say in their government. That's how it was early. So the second thing they rested upon, because in those days, and many, many years afterwards, women weren't recognized as one that could vote or make a say in their government. So the second thing they rested upon was the right of all adult males to vote and to have a say in their government. What would they have thought about Hillary Clinton, a lady running for president? Think about that. Okay? So, the colony rested upon the following. 1, the consent of the governed. 2, the right of all adult males to vote and have a say in their government. And what do you think the third thing they rested upon that kind of had to do with where he got in trouble? Very good. They could worship any way they wished. The guarantee to worship as they wished. Well, he started that charter when? When did he get that? 1644. They made those rules, so to speak, or they rested upon the consent of the governed, the right of adult males to vote and to say in their government, and the guarantee to worship if they wish. So they only discriminated at that point against women, right? Well, they had a new charter that was established in 1663 where they're also going to discriminate a little bit against men to vote. Okay? So in 1644, all adult males had the right to vote, right? Well, they changed that in a new charter in 1663, stating in order for an adult male to vote, what did he have to have? Certain amount of property. Very good. So they changed the charter in 1663, stating in order to vote, an adult male had to own a certain amount of property. Which didn't exactly go over well with those that didn't have that much property, right? Caused some discontent. But even though, with this decision, Rhode Island gave more freedom to more settlers than any other colony that was established to that point. So even though you had to own a certain amount of land to vote, by virtue of the new charter in 1663, it still gave settlers in Rhode Island more freedom than any other settlers in any other colonies at that time. Any questions on that? Okay, we're going to move on. We're going to move westward to Connecticut. Westward to Connecticut. Tell you how that all started. Yeah, Mason.
What's the deal with like Roanoke Island?
In Rhode Island?
Like there was a colony or a
That road up, well, we may talk about that later, I'm not sure yet. Yes?
How did they get, like, he started his own country, so who came with him, his followers, or the new?
You mean to Rhode Island?
Yeah.
Well, who do you think might have come with? That's a good question. Who do you think kind of came with him? Well, not so much Indians. How about that congregation in Salem? Well, yeah, his followers. And then they had some more come from England also, when they found out that they had these freedoms. So, okay, westward to Connecticut. Now, Connecticut, what did what did Rhode Island spring up from? Members of the Massachusetts Bay Colony made up Rhode Island, right? Well, the same thing happened in Connecticut, only it wasn't people that had different beliefs, it was pioneers, not exiles. What's an exile? Roger Williams was an exile. Kicked out of their country. In this case, Massachusetts Bay Colony was kicked out of there. We're going to send him back to England, got away. They probably didn't care, because he wasn't there anymore, right? So, Connecticut was also formed from members of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but they were pioneers, not exiles. And here's what happened. In 1635, a reverend by the name of Thomas Hooker took nearly all the members of his church, and they decided to move out of the colony, and they wanted to settle some wilderness land near Hartford, a village of Hartford. So again, in 1635, a reverend by the name of Thomas Hooker and nearly all the members of his church decided they wanted to move out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they wanted to settle a little southwest of there through a wilderness that was located in a village called Hartford. So they weren't leaving because they were upset. They weren't necessarily leaving because they wanted them to go. They wanted to branch out. And did the Massachusetts Bay Colony stop them from doing that? No, because they weren't exiles. Exiles would have kicked out. They weren't criminals. They were pioneers. They wanted to branch out. Okay? So they didn't really mind too much. So Reverend Hooker and his followers settled at Hartford in 1635. Other pioneers followed suit. There were settlements at Windsor and Wethersfield. And once other pioneers moved to Windsor and Wethersfield, the three communities, Hartford, Windsor, and Wethersfield, joined together and adopted a plan of government, also known as the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. So, we'll back up again. Connecticut sprang out from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It comprised of pioneers, not exiles. In 1635, the Reverend Thomas Hooker and nearly all of his members of his church decided to move farther out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, west through the wilderness, settling at Hartford, a village there. Other pioneers followed suit. Some settled at Windsor, some settled at Wethersfield. Once all the settlement was established, the three communities joined together and they adopted a plan of government that would govern all three communities, which became known as the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. Do they have a charter? No. Matter of fact, after 20 more years and 15 towns later, King Charles II finally allowed Connecticut a charter. So they didn't even get a legal right to the land for 20 years after this Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. So more than 20 years later, in 1662, after not 3, but 15 towns had been settled, is when King Charles II finally allowed Connecticut a charter. 20 years later, 15 towns later.
So how did that affect the people in Connecticut before they had a charter? What was the difference?
Well, that's a great question. Now, see, this guy's, he's on the ball. So, let's talk about that. So, they used the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut for 20 years and 15 towns later before they got a charter. Once they got a charter, the charter allowed the settlers to govern themselves. Now, was it legal to govern themselves prior to the charter like they were doing?
No.
No. So the only difference is, Mason, is once the charter came, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, the self-governing documents, became legal. They actually were illegal because these guys were governing themselves without a charter that stated they could do so prior to that.
But there weren't really any consequences to them being
No.
illegal?
No. Now, it's kind of interesting because this charter allowed the settlers the right to govern themselves legally, and it would be a practice that they would use after the Revolutionary War. So after the Revolutionary War, Connecticut's still going to use the same plan of government. So it was a very long-standing government, very well established, and one of our better plans of government that we've had. Because when you look at a nation, let's just clear this up. We have national laws and we have state laws. Okay? Give me an example of a state law that isn't a national law in Colorado. Marijuana is legal. So marijuana can be legal in Colorado, it's not legal in Wyoming. It's kind of a weird thing when you think about it, kind of inconsistent, but states do have the right, in some instances, to trump national. So a lot of times something will come up and the federal government will say, well, that's a state matter, they can handle that on their own. Okay? It even goes farther than that. I'll give you an example which is a little off base, but I think it's worth mentioning. The Wyoming High School Activities Association has a rule that you have to pass 5 classes a semester to be eligible to participate in their athletics, which means you could actually get 5 Ds and 2 Fs and still be eligible. Okay? Now, how many schools in Wyoming do you think follow just that policy? Maybe some, a handful. And those are usually districts in which they have a lot of at-risk students. I'll just put it that way. Okay? So, it comes down to local control. Why can our school have a different policy for academic eligibility than what the state has? Because the state is like the big government, and they're saying that the state government or the high school can make up their own rules tighter if they want to. Now, is that necessarily equitable? If a kid in another school gets to participate and he's a good player with 4 or 5 Ds and 2 Fs, and you could never do that, could you here? Is that equitable? Not really. Another example of local control where a lower entity has it. We have a Hathaway Scholarship in Wyoming, right? We all heard of that, I assume. And it all matters on 2 things. What are they? 3 things, actually. GPA, ACT score, and then you have to take the right curriculum, the right classes. Now, is it equitable in the state of Wyoming that we have a 90, 80, 70, 60 grade scale where maybe Cody has 93 to 100 as an A, 85 to 92 as a B? There are schools in the state that have different grading scales. So is that equitable? Could you complain about that if you were a student that was in a 92 to 100 school? Because you're 91% that you get an A for, they get a B. And there's a lot of money at stake here. I never understood that. But then when you ask Hathaway about that, they tell you that is a local matter. That each school district can put whatever grading scale they want. So basically that's what the government state here is. They allowed the Fundamental Orders in Connecticut to rule that state, which would have been different than the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which would have been different than another colony. Okay? All right. Let's move on to New Hampshire and Maine. New Hampshire and Maine. The last 2 of settling the northern colonies. New Hampshire and Maine. Where do you think these guys came from that settled New Hampshire and Maine? The Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they were pioneers also that were branching off. They had 20,000 people, remember, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony? Some people got tired of that congestion, I'm sure, so they started to pioneer off. This was no different. These pioneers for the Massachusetts Bay Colony went northward, into an area that we now know as Maine and New Hampshire. So they went north of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Well, it's kind of interesting because they weren't the first one there. In 1622, John Mason and Sir Fernando Gorges actually had been granted the right to settle that territory way back in 1622. So these pioneers that took off from the Massachusetts Bay Colony were not the first ones that went up there. A fellow by the name of John Mason and a fellow by the name of Sir Fernando Gorges actually had been granted the first right to settle that territory known as New Hampshire and Maine. And they actually tried to establish colonies. Now they split it up. How do you think they did that? What do you think, Shania? How did Mason and Gorges split up that land? Very good. Gorges took the northern territory that we know as Maine and New Hampshire, and Mason took the southern part of that territory that we know as Maine and New Hampshire, and they tried to establish colonies in 1629. Didn't have very much luck. Basically, you know what these colonies were considered? Trading posts. What's a trading post? It's just a one-stop place, you know what I mean? So are they really a colony if they're a trading post? One or two people there? No. But these guys tried. Mason and Gorges tried to establish colonies in 1629. They divided the land. Gorges took the northern part of the land. Mason took the southern part. They didn't have very much luck settling it. It was really no more than trading posts. Well, when these settlers began moving northward from Massachusetts, out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they just simply took over the land that was claimed by Mason and Gorges. Just took their land. Just took it over. Thank you for taking this. Now, Massachusetts Bay Colony was thinking to itself, okay, think about this. We got Rhode Island as a result of people that came from our company. We got Connecticut as a result of people that came from our colony. We better keep a little better eye on this movement northward into these new colonies. And so they did take note. And because of that, the Massachusetts Bay Colony actually gained control initially over both Maine and New Hampshire. So they didn't let these go quite as easy as they let Rhode Island and Connecticut. They began to see what was happening here, and they were losing people, and were they following their form of government in these new colonies?